Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today I'm throwing another bone to the people on the channel, the subscribers that really like ancient history. I've said before, I really like it too. It's just one of those things that I feel like less people are interested in than not even more modern history, but more modern than ancient history. Um, But I really like it, and I have subscribers on the channel that also really like it. So I'm going to try to slot in some more ancient history stuff going forward. We're going to do an overly sarcastic video today. I have not done any of theirs, I don't think. This one is going to be over ancient Egypt. So I'm interested to see what they have to say. Let's get into it.
King of the South and North, Ptolemy the Fifth. Oh, hey, didn't see you there. I was just doing some light reading. Fun timing, actually, because after Napoleon stumbled onto this giant multilingual rock while on campaign in 1799, the Egyptian hieroglyphs were first translated from the matching Greek inscription exactly 200 years ago in 1822. Our ability to read the language opened the floodgates to modern Egyptology, and an archaeological discovery of that magnitude was only matched by Howard Carter finding the exquisitely preserved tomb of King Tut in 1922. But beyond the surface level aesthetics of fancy pictures, mummies, and giant D4s in the middle of the desert, what's really the story of ancient Egypt? Well, in celebration of Egyptology's double centennials, let's do some history. Now, before all this shiny modern scholarship, ancient observers had written plenty of accounts, but despite the best attempts of Herodotus' Histories and Manetho's Aegyptica, these were outside perspectives on ancient Egypt. Even the name comes from Greek, Aegyptos, whereas the original name is Kemet, referring to the fertile black soil along the banks of the Nile. As with the name, so too was all of ancient Egyptian society defined by this one water source. The Nile's annual floods deposited new layers of silt on the surrounding land, which made Egyptian farms the most abundant and consistent in the entire ancient Near East. Once grown,
Yeah, and it's really the consistency that makes Egypt kind of stand out, right? Because when you look at everything else around Egypt or even in kind of surrounding regions, states, countries, societies come and go, they rise and fall, and Egypt is kind of the steady force there, right? It's just kind of always there. And I have this kind of running joke on Discord that Egypt doesn't conquer anybody, they only get conquered. But they are the pinnacle of stability. And I think a huge part of that is specifically because of the food source, right? You have the water, you have the annual flooding, you have the soil. It's the food that makes it so perfect for a major society to come and basically never have to leave.
crops could easily travel by ship, and whomsoever had the biggest boat essentially had instant control of the entire river and the ability to govern everyone within line of sight of it. Which was everyone. With one easy source for water, food, trade, and power, that's the core criteria for civilization, so we're in business. Consequently, one quirk of Egyptian geography is that south, where the river started, is up, while north, where the river branches into the delta and empties into the Mediterranean, is down. So Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt are charmingly reversed. Plus, each one comes with a neat crown. Fine on their own, but better together as demonstrated by Narmer, who unified the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt both figuratively and literally. The man smushed the crowns together, becoming the first proper king of Egypt. We know this from King List, recorded later on, where he's referred to as Menes, which we used to think was a different person, but he's probably the same. And we also have what's called the Narmer palette, an artistic depiction of Narmer unifying Egypt. It's not quite clear where strict history ends and legend begins, but it vividly and kinda brutally tells the story as Egyptians understood it.
And that's kind of an issue overall with ancient history, right? Is almost everything has some sort of angle to it that is religious, as in, with the gods, or biased towards a certain group of people, or, mythical almost. And so it's hard to kind of dice out exactly what is completely true and what was like more added on. But the general idea is that you can get a overall view and grasp over the ancient histories that have survived down to us.
Just as cool is how, right out of the gate, we have art in profile, the two crowns, hieroglyphic writing, and Falcon Boy Horus. By the third dynasty, things got even more on brand as the pharaohs started building pyramids. Working from earlier styles of big stone masonry and possibly inspired by Mesopotamian architecture, King Djoser built the first step pyramid in Egypt. After further experiments, one of which collapsed in on itself, oops, the kings of the fourth dynasty built the big fancy pyramids at Giza, which in their day would have been coated in white limestone and capped in gold. As a pure architectural achievement, the pyramids are spectacular, but the reality is that's a lot of work for a dead guy, so later dynasties shifted focus to building temples and other more usable structures. Ancient Egypt didn't emerge fully formed, but it's impressive what does appear at the start of dynastic history, with the pleasantly terrifying implication that several core aspects of Egyptian culture go back not just to the Old Kingdom, but even before Narmer. I should specify, the term Old Kingdom, along with Middle and New Kingdom, are modern conventions to distinguish periods of dynastic continuity and general stability with the intermediate periods, where something or other goes wrong. The first intermediate period began at the tail end of the 6th dynasty, where King Pepi II was several decades into his reign and appeared to be going senile. So in the absence of central authority, nomarchs in charge of the provinces gobbled up power for themselves and even established their own local dynasties. Though they paid lip service to the kings in Heracleopolis and Thebes, as there were competing dynasties in different cities, the next 130 years was a provincial free-for-all until King Mentuhotep II up in Thebes conquered Lower Egypt to reunite North and South, booted out all the hereditary nomarchs and replaced them with new ones actually loyal to the king, and thus kicked off the Middle Kingdom. These next 3 centuries were pleasantly chill on the political front thanks to Mentuhotep's reforms, so the main development was cultural as literature got more popular and accessible. In the Old Kingdom, spells to be used by the pharaohs in the afterlife were inscribed on the walls and sarcophagi of pyramids, while in the intermediary period that expanded to include coffin texts, so that high-ranking officials outside the royal circle could have some assistance on their way into the afterlife. By the later Middle Kingdom, this slow democratization of the afterlife culminated in the Book of the Dead, a personalized dummy's guide to the underworld filled with spells and stories to be buried alongside an individual. This requires a fairly robust conception of the afterlife, otherwise we're just casting spells in the dark, so it's likely this literature developed in response to the growing cult of Osiris, the god of the dead. Beyond looking metaphorically down, Egypt also began looking outwards to their neighbors, as Senusret III conquered south along the Nile into Nubia while building trade relations with Mesopotamia. This was great until it slightly backfired, because when travelers, merchants, and migrants from the Levant came to settle in Lower Egypt in the latter decades of the Middle Kingdom, they realized that the 13th dynasty's authority wasn't all that strong and didn't extend very far beyond the capital city of Ishtawi. So in the absence of any meaningful resistance, some Canaanites declared a new dynasty, set up a new capital at Avaris, and started ruling Lower Egypt.
Yeah, again, Egypt goes out to conquer, boom, immediately gets part of its country conquered. I don't know what to tell you.
Apparently, it was that easy, because about a century later, another Asiatic group called the Hyksos did the exact same thing. The pharaohs up in Thebes surely weren't thrilled, but they couldn't even handle a local mini-dynasty at Abydos, so when the Hyksos eventually rolled into Thebes around 1580, they were powerless to stop it. They almost had all of Egypt too, until a dynastic dispute back down in Avaris forced them to regroup, which gave the new 17th dynasty in Thebes time to rebuild and launch a counterattack. The first 2 kings of the war died on campaign, but the third guy made it work, fully reuniting Egypt under Theban authority and beginning the New Kingdom period. His first order of business was stopping that whole mess from happening again, so he conquered into the Levant to smack them around a little and make sure they didn't get ideas, as well as reconquering into Nubia to open the gold mines back up. Of course, there's more ways to get cash than ripping it out of the ground or stealing its spear points. There's the polite method of selling stuff, as enthusiastically practiced by the pharaoh Queen Hatshepsut. She wound up on the throne after promoting herself from regent and is best known for launching a trading expedition expedition to the land of Punt at the base of the Red Sea, as well as re-establishing trade routes with the Near East. All that incoming wealth financed one of the biggest building programs in Egyptian history, with Hatshepsut embellishing existing temples like the one at Karnak, as well as making brand new structures like her triple colonnaded mortuary temple. This was a more efficient alternative to single-use pyramids because they were way the hell smaller, but also served as a site of public worship for the pharaoh after death, while they themselves took a nice long nap in the Valley of the Kings.
Yeah, and the trade itself, I feel like you can tell when Egypt was in a good spot versus a bad spot by when the things around them are dated, right? Because the trade and the economy in general is such a big part of not just them flourishing, because that's kind of for all general societies, but for kind of overall stability, right? And so, yeah, when you have this trade expansion, you have this wealth come in, new things are starting to be built, more you have more stability, less threats to the throne, and things are generally going well. It's not always that way, but it is a good time period, you know. But what's crazy to me is this is absolutely not decided, but there has been some argument over the past couple of years on if we have dated the early pyramids and early building structures in general for ancient Egypt wrong. If some of the structures are actually way older than what we think they are. This has been a back and forth, and if they actually go back to like the old kingdom, right? There has been some back and forth about this over the past couple of years, but for forever, the assumption was that it was what we thought. I mean, there really wasn't even much discussion on it. The idea was that we had kind of figured it out. Over the past few years, there's been more of a discussion, more of a back and forth. And that's actually really interesting to me because if things like that were done way before when we think they were done, then the history that we have for Egypt drastically shifts, right? I mean, it's not like all these rulers and things like that go away. They obviously still ruled. Obviously, they still had, the internal struggles or rebellions, and they still had places that they conquered and didn't conquer. But our interpretation of the earlier years of ancient Egypt drastically shift. The ground moves immediately from under their feet.
This didn't stop the tombs from being robbed, but, well, neither did the pyramids, so why waste the effort? Back in the land of the living, Hatshepsut's stepson Thutmose III went on campaign after campaign after campaign to extend Egypt's dominion from down in Nubia all the way
Yeah, he went absolutely nuts.
up to Syria. The kingdom became so fabulously wealthy that a Babylonian king once told Amenhotep III, "In your country, gold is like dust." While the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty were having a grand old time, they weren't the only ones with resources and power. See, after the expulsion of the Hyksos, the cult of the god Amun gained immense prestige as thanks for his help liberating Egypt, and he fused with the primary sun god to become Amun-Ra, the patron god of all Egypt. With that kind of clout, the priesthood of Amun's power rivaled only the pharaoh. There was one king who saw this process unfolding and tried to stop it, but he went just a smidge overboard with it. Amenhotep IV completely banned the worship of Amun-Ra, made a new capital away from Thebes in the Temple of Amun at Karnak, and promoted a new cult worshipping the sun disk Aten with whom only the pharaoh could commune.
Yeah, yikes. I've talked about this before, but I'm incredibly interested by the lead god or the head god that ancient societies worship and kind of put over their civilization. And the reason for that is they kind of mirror what they want in a leader. And so whatever attributes depending on the society, but in a lot of cases, they'll put the attributes that they see in a good leader on the god who is the lead god, right? Is the leader of the gods. And so that's really interesting to me. It gives kind of a interesting insight and perspective into how the civilization in general kind of saw things. But you couldn't do this hardly anywhere. I mean, you would have issues. Obviously, the priests in societies where gods were big, which is most societies in the ancient world, the priests had immense power in a ton of those societies. And you can understand why. The gods are a huge deal, and the priests are working, talking, everything they do is on behalf of the gods. They're given, they're doing sacrifices, animal sacrifices, and reading entrails and bird signs and all sorts of crazy stuff, right? But that gives them immense power in those societies. And so if you went into any of them and basically trashed the lead god, pulled him off his throne, and put a new god up there, there would be chaos. I mean, there would be absolute chaos.
Thus granting the renamed Akhenaten sole power, pun intended, over his newly diet monotheistic state. Unfortunately, his first and only act as autocrat was kind of nothing, so nobody was governing and the economy fell in the tank, and when the new pharaoh, Tutankhamun, undid all that Aten nonsense and got things back on track, everybody was relieved, especially the priesthood of Amun. But before that ominous plotline comes to a head, there's one more monarch on the list who puts all the rest to shame, and that is Ramses II. Coming in strong with stable governance, renewed trade, plenty of building, and surprisingly robust international relations, the man did a lot with his 7 decades in power. He launched several campaigns into the Levant to consolidate his holdings and fend off the Anatolian Hittite Empire, and while his military operations were moderately successful, his military propaganda was outstanding. Ramses returned from the Battle of Kadesh proclaiming the greatest victory in Egyptian history with monuments dedicated to his glory, but the actual battle was basically a draw, and
Yeah, and I have another video that I'm going to do that's specifically over the Battle of Kadesh. This is absolutely true. There are still, like, if you go look up Ramses today, there are still things that you read that are basically all about how brilliant of a military genius he was, which that's some crazy PR. If your stuff was so good that, thousands of years into the future, they're still saying the things that your propaganda was putting out, that's wild.
he didn't even take the city of Kadesh. He did, however, end up striking a formal peace treaty with the Hittites, which allowed him to turn his focus inward and get to building. Between a new capital in the Nile Delta, a gigantic mortuary temple in Thebes, and a complex way up the river in Nubia, Ramses shelled out on monuments all along the Nile like nobody could even dream, transforming the entire face of Egypt. Lucky timing that he got to it when he did, because in a half century, it all falls apart. Yeah, unfortunately for Ramses III, the crises were frequent and numerous. First were the invasions, or possibly just migrations, of various peoples from the northern Mediterranean, whom he begrudgingly allowed to settle in Sinai and the Levant. Meanwhile, overseas trade dried up because all the other civilizations of the Late Bronze Age were in the process of collapsing, and all that fighting left the treasury low on funds, so the tomb builders went on strike. They did come back, but the fact that Ramses' main temple complex had defensive fortifications was a very bad sign. And to cap it off, a conflict between potential heirs ended with Ramses getting assassinated by his great wife. Well, one of them. That was partly the issue. After that, subsequent rulers were no match for persistent droughts, nor the priesthood of Amun, who were now fully in charge of Upper Egypt from their base in Thebes and taking on royal titles to fit their newfound stature. There was still an actual pharaoh down in the Delta, but crazy coincidence, he was related to the high priest. So silly! The breakdown of central authority in the Third Intermediate Period wasn't that bad of a time on its own, but it left Egypt wide open to foreign rule, as Libyans who settled in the Delta in centuries prior wound up ruling for 2.5 dynasties. The kingdom intermittently came together before falling back apart, and this tempting opportunity caught the eye of the Nubians from the Kingdom of Kush. On paper, once again not great, because after King Kashta installed his daughter as chief priestess of Amun, his son King Pi conquered the whole of Egypt and established a new dynasty of Kushite rulers. Thing is, these guys...
Yeah, this is the interestingly, I feel like when people see these statues and things like this, the Kushites are very, like, you can specifically see and tell the time difference of when it's the Kushites and when it's not, which is interesting because I feel like you can't do that with a whole bunch of other time periods for Egypt.
guys had a long relationship with Egypt and actually really admired their civilization, so although Egypt was ruled by foreigners, they governed well, built more pyramids, and preserved the culture, amounting to probably the best century Egypt has had since the New Kingdom. Unfortunately, other conquerors were on the way, as when the Assyrian Empire marched out from Mesopotamia into the Nile Delta in the 660s BC to sack Memphis and Thebes before installing a puppet dynasty and calling it a day. The Kushites withdrew back to their homeland up the river, leaving Egypt to figure itself out.
And again, the Assyrians did this with everything and everybody in the region for forever. They were extremely brutal and ruthless about it, and it's why everybody in the region hated the Assyrians and were not in the least bit sad to see them fall. There's actually a story in the Bible that is specifically over the fall of Assyria. The prophet Nahum, I think, is who it was. But you can hear the vitriol in his voice when he is writing about Assyria falling, which most historians think he was a contemporary of the fall of Assyria. So he was actually like there for it. And it just, the anger and hatred towards the Assyrians just drips off the page. If you have a chance, you should read it. It's, the Book of Nahum, I believe is what it is. I may be totally wrong on the name, but I think that's what it is.
Despite some success in resisting Assyrian influence, Egypt would remain at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. Later that century, the Assyrians got conquered by the Babylonians, who became the threat du jour, but then they got yoinked by the Achaemenid Persian Empire.
And the story that's told for when the Persians send an emissary group, that group is killed by the Egyptians, and then the Persians are pissed. It's an incredible story. It's extremely brutal and ruthless, but at some point I'll try to cover it. It's too long to tell now.
Who then also conquered Egypt and actually kept it this time. Egypt was no stranger to rule by foreigners, but this was the first time that the Kingdom of the Nile was merely a distant corner of a much larger empire. Granted, this was the Persian Empire, so they were actually cool with Egyptian culture, but it's the principle of the thing, you know? So naturally, Egyptians tried their hand at breaking free, and with help from Greek mercenaries, they snuck in a little half-century of independence. Persia did eventually come back, but they wouldn't stay for long, because Alexander, the Macedonian twink, came on in to build an even bigger empire. But he died, really fast. So in 323, his general Ptolemy snagged a piece of the shattering Macedonian Empire and became the new pharaoh of Egypt. His Ptolemaic dynasty had its share of ups and downs and catastrophic inbreeding, but it honestly did pretty well for itself, as the coastal capital of Alexandria became the pinnacle of Hellenistic culture.
Yeah, this is when Egypt becomes the Egypt of the ancient world, right? Kind of what you think about as you're moving towards, the newer time period, the new age. You're getting out of really, really old history, and getting more into the Greeks and then the Romans, and this is the Egypt under the Ptolemaic Empire or dynasty that you kind of think of when you think of Egypt.
The ruling class was almost exclusively Greek. They respected Egyptian culture, honored their gods, and issued royal decrees in both languages, which is why we have documents like the Rosetta Stone. The golden glow of Ptolemaic Egypt reached as far as Rome, who admired the culture, yes, but also realized that an agricultural powerhouse like the Nile would fit perfectly into their growing empire. So, even with a valiant last huzzah by Queen Cleopatra, Egypt became a province of Rome. Despite this rather substantial political change, the biggest shock to Egyptian culture came 3 centuries later with the spread of Christianity. Much more severe than the reforms of Akhenaten, Egyptian pagan temples were converted into churches or abandoned outright, and the rise of Coptic as the main written language made hieroglyphs obsolete. More than 2 centuries before the Muslim conquest in 641, the Egypt of the pharaohs was gone, conquered not by a man, but a god. And with our 3,500 year chronology completed, that's a wrap on the history of ancient Egypt. It's astounding that even with dynasties worth of growth and change and turmoil, the core of that culture held steady and their civilization always came back stronger. Still, despite the mountains of evidence we found with modern archaeology, there's a fundamental mysteriousness to all that grandeur that somehow makes it even more fascinating. As the more we learn, the more we want to learn. Ugh, stupid learning, being interesting. I tell you, this whole thing is just one big pyramid scheme. Oh, God.
Jesus. Okay, so that was the Overly Sarcastic's history of Egypt. I like that. I felt like he did well with it. And again, with the stability and long-term kind of staying power, I feel like a lot of it is the access to food. You have access to food, you have access to major waterways, and that's really, really a big part of having a society in the ancient world. So really, really big deal. But yeah, this was a good one. Again, I have the battle video that I'm going to get to later on. So I'll in the next couple of days that'll be out on the channel. But as always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. I'll put the link to the Discord down below, and I'll see you all next time.